Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is Professor Joseph Henrich. And Professor Henrich is known for a fantastic book called Word. It's excellent. I read it. You should all go and buy it or get it. Find a way to get it. It's a terrific book. So, how are you doing, Joseph?
Doing great. Good to be with you.
Yes, it's great to be with you too, Joseph. So, Joseph, today we're going to do an interview in two parts. So, first, we're going to talk about your original research on culture, and then we'll talk about weird. Joseph, what is culture? How do cultures evolve? And why are some places more innovative than others?
Yes, so within the field of cultural evolution, we think of culture as information stored in people's brains that got there through some form of learning, usually social learning. So humans, unlike other species, are particularly inclined to learn from other people, and that gets stored in our brains in some way. And so you can think of culture as the distribution of ideas, beliefs, and values, some kind of information stored in different brains. The word information has a little bit of a cold kind of computer feel to it, but this could be emotions or affective reactions, all kinds of valences, things like that, as well as, how do you make a bow and arrow or something like that. And so that's culture is socially learned information. It could be dance or ritual or, like I said, technology. And then we can think about how that changes over time. And one of the key insights, I think, is thinking about the cognitive or psychological processes that allow people to learn from each other. So if you use the logic of natural selection and evolutionary theory, you can begin to make predictions and develop theories about how children and adults should learn from other people. So who they should pay attention to, what kinds of information they should attend to, and how they should integrate information across different people. And so now there's a rich body of evidence from developmental psychology and other places showing how even very young children and infants will be selective in who they pay attention to and what kinds of information they take in. And so you can think of that as a filtering system that's always changing the distribution of ideas and beliefs and values and all kinds of other stuff that goes into this thing we call culture.
And how do cultures evolve?
Well, the key is thinking about how individuals learn from each other. And one of the key things that happens is the emergence of social norms. So once people can learn a behavior, like say a food taboo, and they can learn the standards for judging others, you shouldn't eat a certain food, enforcing the food taboo, then you get these sticky things called norms. And lots of societies are structured by these different rules where everybody has to comply. And if you don't, people will think badly of you, you get a bad reputation or something like that. And so this kind of governs social life. And then one of the things that influences this is that there can be competition amongst different groups with different social norms. And this can occur in all kinds of different ways, but then over time, you can get the emergence of norms that lead to more cooperation or more greater in-group harmony, things like that.
And Joseph, you are famous for teaching us that necessity is not the mother of invention. How do societies innovate?
Yes, so one of the key ideas that I've been working on is something I call the collective brain. And this is the idea that most new ideas are actually recombinations of existing ideas, usually that we acquired from learn from other people. Of course, now in the modern world, that could be acquired through reading something somebody wrote, but that's still kind of a form of social learning, social transmission. So it creates these novel recombinations. And when we look even at this, small scale human societies, so Rob Boyd and Michelle Klein did a study in Oceania where they showed that larger islands in Oceania before the European expansion those that had larger populations had more marine foraging technologies and more complex marine foraging technologies. So the idea there is that the larger population, there's more minds working on the problem, more opportunities to recombine ideas, and then you get fancier technology over time. And of course, throughout human history, lots of times people have needed very necessary technologies and just not invented it and died out or had to flee or other kinds of things instead. And lots of great technologies were invented and then not used at the time. And long periods of time went by before anybody figured out how to use them. So I'm a bit of a skeptic of the, necessity as the mother of invention.
And Joseph, tell us about zero-sum cultures. You also contend that zero-sum cultures impede innovation. And I have some direct examples, and I will share these examples when you're finished.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the ways that humans have of approaching the world is thinking of the world as a zero-sum game. And so a classic example of this would be status competition. So if you're competing for status, it doesn't really matter what your total payoff is. Only one person's going to be considered the best and the second best and on down. So we do have this cognition for zero-sum thinking. But that can be applied more broadly to the world. So one of the things that I've noticed is that societies that are heavily dependent on putting land and wealth tend to be more oriented towards zero-sum thinking because, either, if one person has more land, necessarily the neighbors have less land, right? So because it's kind of a fixed finite resources, unless you're an expanding empire or something. And then that favors all kinds of thinking that deal with, concerns about envy and, how things are being allocated. And people are less likely to invest in things like innovation, developing new relationships, things like that. And in my own research, working in rural southern Chile, I found that people would even, conceal like their good crop returns because they didn't want to be envied and thought to be taking more of this limited good. And then that actually would have suppressed the ability for new cropping practices or, new types of seed, things like that from diffusing out and then leading everyone to have higher production.
Well, today we have excellent studies on envy. Many of them were done by Boris Gershman. So this example is from Jamaica. I was in the public space once. I can't remember the exact words of the song, but the dancehall entertainer said, and I'm going to speak in Jamaican patois. Them things say if things say if we win, them lose. So that's Jamaican patois. So THEM is DEM in Jamaican patois. So if we win, they lose. That's the zero sum mentality. And in Jamaica, envy is a recurring leitmotif in Jamaican dancehall and even politics. So recently, some developers were building a project, and the prime minister said something to the effect that you shouldn't be distracted by bad mind people. So bad mind is the Jamaican word for envy. So in Jamaica, people take envy seriously, and they're right. Based on the research that I have read, in societies where envy is taken seriously, people are actually unlikely to innovate and produce. And for obvious reason, they do not want to encounter blowback.
Right, right. And so people won't seek to innovate and they'll suppress anything, they'll keep things secret. It also, I think, cultivates an environment that is more likely to get certain forms of witchcraft, which Boris has talked about. And then that can multiply these kinds of effects.
Yes, I would love if Boris or somebody else, even you, if any of you could do a study on witchcraft in in Jamaica. So well, Obia is not a religion; it's a system of belief. But during slavery, during slavery, Obia was often employed by the braver enslaved Africans or people of African descent to challenge the plantocracy. So in Europe, Europeans regulated witchcraft, and in Jamaica, they also regulated witchcraft, what they deemed to be obia. But obia even then connoted negativity in the eyes of planters and even enslaved people from Africa. So today in Jamaica, obia is conflated with witchcraft. So some people, if they have a shop or a business, they will wet up in front of the establishment. They claim that they're chasing away spirits. This is really fascinating.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
what's
And I
interesting,
think that a lot of folks don't realize how widespread these kinds of beliefs are. Yeah.
and what's interested is that even when controlling for income and education, people still believe in Obi and witchcraft. It doesn't matter if they're rich or if they have a PhD or if they're black or white.
Yeah.
They do think that other people can bewitch them.
Oh, yeah. And so I've been working on this with the economist Nathan Nunn and John Paul Caravello. And Nathan has all this cool data from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I think tells a similar story to the one you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. It's really fascinating. I was speaking to a friend recently, a teacher, and he was telling me about a story that they found bottles in the river with notes in them making certain requests. And more interesting is that in the education system, apparently some young men, they were led astray, and because they were led astray, they're involved in criminal activities. These young men were procuring guard rings from Obeah men to protect themselves, and one young man actually killed his schoolmate over the guard ring. Apparently, it was said that somebody stole his guard ring, so yeah, it has led to serious violence.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jamaica is an interesting place, Joseph.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Joseph, the Industrial Revolution, Joel Mokyr. Joel Mokyr is one of my favorite writers on the Industrial Revolution. And Joel argues that the Industrial Revolution that occurred in Europe was sustained by the epistemic base. And this idea has several parallels with your idea of the collective brain. So elites drive economic growth, they build institutions, but their idea should be diffused throughout the society. And I think that this idea is quite similar to your collective brain. So this is a question. Would you do a study on the Industrial Revolution and its linkage to the collective brain? I want you to do something along that line.
Well, I did some preliminary efforts along that in The Weirdest People in the World, where I looked at some of this idea of these voluntary associations, these scientific societies that began to emerge in England and France and other places. And then you can see how those link to, for example, increased amount of patenting when you get a scientific society in a particular county in England, or these towns that were connected through the encyclopedia that disseminated lots of technical and other kinds of knowledge in France. So so at least there's very preliminary stuff. And I also make the case that the nature of European institutions, following work by Joel and others, encourage these kind of recombination of ideas. So for example, one of my favorite things is the apprenticeship institution. So in lots of societies, apprentices were typically would apprentice to masters in their own family or clan or some kind of relative, an uncle or something like that. Whereas in parts of Europe, people would apprentice to strangers, right? And so that's there, you're mixing ideas right away. And then there's also this thing called the journeyman phase. So in the journeyman phase, you've gone through your training, and then the master will, you have to go on to what's the equivalent of a postdoc. So you're not yet a master, but you go on to work in somebody else's shop. Oftentimes the master will require this to be far away, right? Because he doesn't want any competition from someone he just trained. So you have to go far away and sign up to in another master's shop who may have journeymen from other places. So you're bringing together individuals who have just trained, freshly trained under different masters, and then bringing them together in a shop to do whatever it is they do, whether it's making clocks or blacksmithery. And then that seems to be ripe for creating lots of new recombinations and improving things.
It's interesting because markets are not unique to Western countries. The difference between the West and, let's say, Africa is that in Western Europe, you didn't need to associate with people who were directly related to your clan or a part of your church. So in Africa, long distance markets were quite popular, but they were legitimated by kinship ties or religion. And reading your book and other studies, I have discovered that a key difference that led to the great divergence is the role of impartial trust and institutions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of The Weirdest People in the World, is that, trade is old and humans have been trading for a long time and there have been markets. But a lot of times long distance trade was maintained, as you said, by, a network of people in the same religion, like Avner Greif talks about, or kin ties, like clans in China along the Yellow River and whatnot would maintain a sprawling trade network. There's lots of other case examples. And what's can increase the efficiency of markets and trade is if strangers feel like they can engage in mutually beneficial transactions, with a minimum of sort of checks on the trustworthiness of the others. And the more we have trust in each other and trustworthiness, of course, the more free flowing can be commerce. And this also applies to ideas. So this gets back to the collective brain. And that if you have a certain amount of trust in strangers, you can meet and exchange ideas. It might spur innovation in either of the individuals interacting, or they might decide to work together, Bolton and Watt. And then, suddenly they're off building steam engines or something.
Yesterday, I was speaking to Jonathan Beauchamp, one of your co-authors, and I was telling him about the Igbo people. The Igbos are quite interesting. James Robinson wrote a new paper on cultures, and he described the Igbo culture as fluid. And myself, I've read some articles on the Igbo people written mostly by Africans, and they all argue that the Igbos are individualistic and open to new ideas. They're similar to Africans because they do place a premium on the family and the king group, but they're not afraid to venture out of their comfort zone. And the Igbos also have an apprenticeship program that's practiced today in Nigeria. Harvard Business Review and Quartz had articles on the topic. They call it the apprenticeship system forged in war. And it's really successful because a young man, usually some man, he would leave his village to go to the town to work for somebody. He might not know this individual, and for around 5 years, he will work. And then after that period, the young man is settled. So it shows both risk tolerance and long-term orientation.
Right. Yeah, no, that's interesting. And it's important to document these patterns of variation. So there's been a number of different societies that are individualistic, but they can vary in all kinds of interesting ways. So one of the things that I talk about in The Weirdest People in the World are the group I worked with called the Machiganga in the Peruvian Amazon, who are, they're highly individualistic and they have a real sense of personal independence, but their circle of trust really ends at the hamlet, and they don't have extensive trust in strangers, and this then shapes a lot of their subsequent interactions. So this sounds like another interesting ethnographic case where here there are institutions which allow people to go far away and interact with strangers. Although I'm guessing they don't cross ethnic lines with that.
Well, are you talking about the Igbos?
Yeah.
No. The Igbos are, well, okay. So based on what I've read in pre-colonial Igbo society, they were not unlikely to marry outside of the group for political purposes. And today, based on primary accounts, Igbo businessmen have said that they don't have a problem working with the ASA. And actually, if Igbos are dishonest, they will work with other groups. So they seem to be willing to work with people to achieve their goals.
Ah, okay.
And I don't remember the name of the system, but the Igbos have a formal diaspora plan where people migrate to various countries, and there's an Igbo king or somebody who's respected in the Igbo community. And if you're a new Igbo, you're assisted financially or professionally.
I see.
The culture, the Igbo culture is really interesting.
Yeah, that's cool.
In many of the slaves who went to Jamaica, they were taken from the Bight of Biafra, and the Igbos are from that region. So this is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the Igbo people.
Yeah.
Joe, in your book, you listed several societies that scaled up because of religion. How important is religion?
Well, yeah, I think it's quite important, especially as you go further back into human history. So even the smallest scale human societies, many of them will have communal rituals, could be, involving dances and feasting and synchronous movement and other kinds of shared music making that brings people together. Sometimes there'll be painful or terrifying rituals that adolescent males or sometimes females will be put through in order to bind them together. And these binds often last a lifetime. So even, well back into human evolutionary history, people were probably using rituals to build social bonds that expanded the sphere of the society, allowed people to make long-term connections. But then at some point in human history, society expanded to the point where you couldn't have face-to-face rituals to bind people together. So that's my colleagues and I, people like R. Nor and Zion, have argued that people increasingly began to believe in increasingly powerful moralizing gods and other cosmic forces, things like karma and whatnot, that could help societies bind together and help people be cooperative and trusting, even in situations where enduring social ties weren't enough and ritual ties weren't enough. So I've made the case that, one of the first social technologies for building larger scale societies is, this collection of supernatural beliefs and rituals that eventually emerges into what we think of as the world religions.
Interesting. And on the topic of religion, again, the Protestant Revolution. Are we smarter because of the Protestant Revolution? Did that lead to the human capital revolution?
Well, yeah, so I think it's quite clear that the Protestant Reformation placed a premium on being literate, because as a Protestant, you need to learn to read the Bible for yourself. You can't depend on other teachers. A great value is often placed on the individual themselves reading and interpreting the Bible. So you had to learn to become literate. And this led to the proliferation of literacy within Europe. And eventually it becomes part of universal schooling, which, is still spreading across the world today. But that's part of that same movement, where the notion that everybody should go to school and learn to read and get some of those basic skills that are taught in schools. So in that sense, I think that Protestantism did have a big effect. Of course, it was, inadvertent. The Protestants didn't know what they were doing, but that by requiring literacy, they ended up changing people's brains in interesting ways. And then the other thing that I talk a little bit about in the Weirdest People in the World is this notion that some kinds of Protestantism actually began to see doing science as a way of communing with or worshiping God. So Newton had a lot of followers that thought that by decoding the structure of the universe, we were actually seeing into the mind of God. So if you read, Copernicus and some of these, Kepler and those guys, they're kind of religious, right? And so they see this as helping them to understand God. It's only later that gets divorced. Religion and science get divorced at that point.
Peter Harrison is an expert in Protestantism and science, and he has a book. I read it. Peter has several books. This book is called The Fall of Man and the Foundation of Science. Yes, that's the name of the book. And his thesis is quite intriguing. Protestants wanted to restore pre-Adamic knowledge, and it could only be restored if we invested in the empirical method. So human beings are imperfect, and because they're imperfect, they cannot rely on deductive knowledge. They have to investigate. That's how they're going to unlock the mysteries of the world. And as a result, science emerged. It's a bit, I'm simplifying it, but you get the point.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, and that fits with a lot of stuff that I've been looking at, because I'm very interested in kind of the origins of science as one kind of epistemology. And at least, my current thinking about this, although my current book is maybe going in this direction, that, one of the key norms in science is about empirical discourse, and that you couldn't justify things by reference to ancient sages or to logical arguments. You actually had to provide some empirical support for it, and not obvious kind of empirical support. So, and it's almost like a norm in science. Like you can't, that's very much governs scientific discourse. You can't submit an article to a journal and appeal to authority, right? So that sounds right to me, or that sounds very interesting to me.
Now we're going to talk about weird. How did we why are we so individualistic?
Right. Well, so in putting together weird, my taking off point was first by acknowledging and showing that there's all this interesting psychological variation around the world. So societies really vary a lot in how individualistic they are, how much they see themselves as atomic individuals set apart from, their larger social networks, or versus an independent or an interdependent self that's connected to others and gets their identity from this network of social connections, versus getting your identity from the traits you cultivate and whatever those valued traits are. So that varies around societies. Analytic versus holistic thinking varies around societies. People's notions of morality, whether they're more universalistic or more parochial, varies around societies. The role of intentions in moral judgment seems to vary. Temporal discounting, so how patient you are, seems to vary. And so the puzzle that I set myself primarily in The Weirdest People in the World was trying to explain that psychological variation. And there's a bunch of different parts to my story, but at the core of the story is that institutions, the social norms that govern the family, and then also govern market interactions and whatnot, and a few other things, affect how we think, and our minds actually adapt to the institutional and technological worlds that they have to navigate through. And so it affects what we pay attention to, how we process information, and those kinds of things. Yeah, so that was kind of the broad approach.
And is it because of the church? The church outlawed cousin marriages.
Well, yeah, I mean, so in The Weirdest People in the World, I take as my point of departure an observation that a number of historians and anthropologists have made, that the European family is unusual in a global and historical perspective, these monogamous nuclear families. And then again, historians and anthropologists have argued that that family transformed over the course of about 1,000 years due to what I call the marriage and family program of what became the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and that the church began to impose these taboos on marrying more distant relatives. They began to constrain inheritance by testament in case of these more general things, ending corporate ownership of land, ending polygyny, ending levirate marriage, and some of these other forms of marriage that are common across societies. And actually going against stuff that's sort of biblically approved too. That's one of the important elements. This is just not an extension of kind of ancient Hebrew marriage patterns or something like that. So that alters the family structure, is my argument, over the course of about 1,000 years in Europe. And these families then shift people's psychology, making them more individualistic and analytic, more requiring them to engage more with strangers, and eventually building new kinds of organizations, these voluntary associations, built for individuals. And so it puts parts of Western Europe on a different cultural evolutionary trajectory that's shaping people's psychology, making them more individualistic, et cetera, over long stretches of time. And eventually you get things like Protestantism and these kind of higher level things like democracy at the national level and whatnot that also have feedback effects. But I see the core very much of what led Europe to be so much different, to be this unwitting transformation of the European family that had psychological effects.
Yes, an interesting argument. But Joseph, some earlier writers, some are deceased, some are alive but quite old, they argue that the Greeks and Romans also liked monogamy. So there's an argument that even before the advent of medieval church policies, Westerners were still more individualistic. What do you think about that argument? And you have cited some of these people.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Greek case is interesting because people always overgeneralize from Athens to the Greeks. What we know is that Athens, just before the beginning of the classical period, instituted some kinship reforms, including only allowing Athenian men to have one Athenian wife. Now, this is nothing like monogamy as we think of it in the modern world, because rich Athenian men could take as many slave concubines as they wanted. So this was just a rule about the number of Athenian wives you could have. You could have an unlimited number of non-Athenian mates of various kinds. And they also instituted bilateral inheritance, which may have weakened clans and things like that. And, maybe linked to some of the developments of democracy and other kinds of formal institutions in classical Greece, or at least in Athens. Now we switch over to Rome, and it's a similar story where you can only have one Roman wife by definition, but there was sexual slavery and there was concubines and all that kind of stuff in Rome. And the church very much changed that. So the idea that there was like no change is just not consistent with the historical record. The church is against slavery, it's against concubinage, it's against any kind of inheritance rights for someone who isn't married within the church, that kind of thing. So yeah, so it still was quite a transformation.
Yeah, the history of Western individualism is quite puzzling, because I interviewed an academic from Greece, and his thesis is that cross-cultural comparisons originated in Greece. So the Greeks were more receptive to different cultures. They wanted to understand them, not necessarily to refine them. They were interested in appreciating foreign cultures for their own sake. And we see this time and time again when Europeans met scholars from the Arabic world. They were so willing to learn from them. They were receptive. the Jesuits went to China, and the Chinese said that the Jesuit knowledge was justifying older tradition. They were already brilliant. So in most societies, there's usually a battle between the ancient way and the modern way. But in the West, the modern way won. And I think that this explains greatly the great divergence.
Yeah, and that's very much, I feel like in broad strokes, that's consistent with the argument that I make in The Weirdest People in the World. Because one of the things, the psychological changes that I think begins with the transformation of the family is the reduction in the importance of tradition, the respect for elders, and that includes the respect for ancient sages. So, you know, sometime around 1500, it seems like European intellectuals began to realize that Aristotle and Plato and those guys, there was tons of stuff they had wrong and tons of stuff they didn't know about the world. And that there were lots of new discoveries to be made. So just like if you track the spread of the word discovery, it seems to really proliferate after 1500. I'm thinking here of Wooten's book on the evolution of science. And that kind of thing can come about if people are willing to, you know, disrespect elders, essentially. It's not assume that the tradition is the way we should go, and that we can, you know, make our own way in the world and do something new and prefer novelty and things like that, which we still find in work with Jonathan Beauchamp and others. We still find that kinship systems that are have less of this kinship intensity, people are less adhering to tradition, less concerned about obedience to authority and things like that.
All right, so we're wrapping up, Joe. But before I go, question: are you writing a new book?
Yes, and it relates to your earlier question. I'm writing a book called Collective Minds, and it's really trying to put together all of this research that I was talking about the collective brain, and using patent data and all kinds of other data sources to study that, but then also thinking about the evolution of epistemology, which we touched on. So how do collective brains affect what counts as a good reason, what counts as good evidence? And so for lots of places, for China for 2000 years, dream counted as a source of evidence. Divination was used to make state decisions in ancient Greece and China and lots of other places. So at some point, those get devalued as epistemic sources. So I'm trying to understand that process and think about how collective brains affect that.
All right. And I'm sure that for your book, Joel Mokyr has been quite useful.
Oh, yeah. Joel's
yes.
He's a good friend.
Yeah, I would love to have him on the show. But before I leave, if you're not familiar with this professor, you should look him up. George Osterdekoff. He's German. Okay. You'll find him to be quite interesting. He writes on the psychosocial development of society.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you'll definitely like him. All right, Joseph. Speaking to you has been a pleasure.
All right, thank you.
I have to go. Bye.
Bye.